What are hormones? Well, hormones are chemical messengers that are released mainly by glands, and they travel in the bloodstream through all parts of the body to targeted cells. Hormones then tell these cells what to do. Water-soluble hormones bind to receptors on the surface of cells, and the message is delivered and the cell does its duty. Fat-soluble hormones actually enter cells and bind to receptors once inside. Again, message delivered and the cell does its duty. For example, glucagon is a hormone produced by the pancreas. After we eat, carbohydrates are broken down into glucose. The liver sends some of this glucose into the bloodstream to cells throughout the body. The cells use this glucose as energy. The liver takes any extra glucose and stores it as glycogen, or as fat. As this glucose in the bloodstream gets used up by cells, the liver needs to release more. And this is where glucagon comes in. The pancreas releases glucagon hormones which attach to receptors on liver cells. Glucagon tells the liver cells we need more glucose, and the liver cells convert the stored glycogen into glucose and release it into the bloodstream to keep those hungry cells fed. There are many different hormones in the body that have many different functions. There are hormones that help with blood pressure regulation, development of white blood cells, in response to stress, regulation of water retention in the kidneys, and I could go on and on and on. But I think you get the picture. They're kind of important in the body. And that be the basics on hormones.
The three major types of hormones. And the first major type of hormones are proteins and polypeptides. And just as a refresher, proteins and polypeptides are made up of amino acids, and these amino acids are linked together with peptide bonds. And so many peptide bonds come together to form a polypeptide or a protein. And these proteins and polypeptides form most of our body's hormones. And these hormones can range from small to large. And to give you an example of what I mean by that, imagine 3 or so amino acids linked together forming a hormone. That would be a small polypeptide. And 3 amino acids, we're talking about a handful of atoms, maybe 20 or so atoms. And just as a frame of reference, a cell in your body, one cell, has on the order of 1 trillion atoms just inside that one cell, and there are 100 trillion cells in your body, and so we're talking about very, very, very small things, and they can range from these small collections of amino acids all the way up to hundreds and hundreds of amino acids, so they can get quite large, and the break point becomes right around 100, and that's where we shift from calling them polypeptides to proteins. And just like all proteins in your body that are going to be excreted, proteins and polypeptide hormones are made in the rough endoplasmic reticulum of the cell, and I'll shorten that to RER, and they go from the rough endoplasmic reticulum to the Golgi apparatus. And from the Golgi apparatus, they're kind of repackaged into vesicles that can eventually be excreted from the cell. And because proteins and polypeptides are made of amino acids, they're typically charged, which makes them water soluble, but it also gives them a really hard time crossing cell membranes. And so typically their receptors are located in or on a cell surface. And because the receptors are located in or on a cell surface, and these protein and polypeptide hormones can't actually travel into the cell, what they do is they initiate a cascade effect of secondary messengers inside the cell. And I'm going to do an entire video about how that signaling cascade using secondary messengers actually works, but the main idea is that when these protein and polypeptide hormones bind to the cell's surface, they initiate a response inside the cell, and we refer to that as a secondary messenger system. And so to save some time, I went ahead and drew in an example of a polypeptide hormone, and I'm going to kind of fade it in for us. And I want to show you on this drawing where the peptide bonds are, because these peptide bonds really pull this class together and unify them. And so right in between the carbon and the nitrogen here, and the carbon and the nitrogen here, I'll draw some arrows. These are the peptide bonds that I was referring to, these carbon-nitrogen bonds. And so they can be small and they can be large, but these links of amino acids that are used as chemical messengers to signal effects in the body are called proteins and polypeptides. And one example is insulin. Insulin is a relatively large hormone, and so it's a protein hormone. Okay, so we've got proteins and polypeptides, and then the second major type of hormones are steroids. And when we hear steroids, I don't know, the first thought that comes to my mind are a bunch of athletes getting in trouble with their regulating committees. But steroids are actually one of the major types of hormones used in our body to communicate. And so there are a lot of steroids in our body. But steroids come from lipids. And the major lipid that these steroids come from is cholesterol. And because they come from cholesterol, steroids have a really characteristic structure that all of them share. And so I went ahead and I pre-drew that as well. I'm going to fade that in. And so this is kind of the characteristic steroid backbone. And so you can see there are 4 ring structures here, and these rings are made of carbon atoms. And so there are 3 cyclohexane rings, or 6-membered carbon rings, and 1 cyclopentane ring. And I'm going to label those A, B, C, and D. And with this characteristic structure comes a really characteristic way of signaling a cell. And so unlike proteins and polypeptides whose receptors are on the cell surface, steroids, because they're made of lipids, have a really easy time passing through the cell membrane, and their receptors are located inside the cell. And so steroids usually go all the way inside of the cell to signal their receptor as primary messengers. They're actually doing the signaling. And oftentimes their receptors are located either in the cytoplasm or all the way in the nucleus. But steroids typically go in and their effect goes all the way down to the transcription and translation level of proteins. And so as primary messengers, they're going inside the cell and they're affecting a change in that cell that's going to result in the transcription and the translation of new proteins and new products inside the cell. And I'm going to do a video on how these steroids actually affect the cell as well. But for now, I want you to be thinking of steroids as one of the major hormones that are in our body, not just a means for athletes getting an edge on the competition. And so some examples of big steroids in the body are those that come from the adrenal cortex, like cortisol and aldosterone. And those hormones that come from the gonads, like the sex hormones, testosterone and estrogen and progesterone. And so we've got steroids and we've got proteins and polypeptides, and the third major type of hormones by structure are tyrosine derivatives. And tyrosine derivatives come from the amino acid tyrosine. And you might have caught on that I said these come from tyrosine, which is an amino acid. And I told you earlier that protein and polypeptide hormones are made of amino acids, and so you might ask yourself, why do these get their own major class if these are also made of an amino acid? And what makes them really special, A, is that they're made of one amino acid, so one amino acid, tyrosine, is manipulated to make these hormones. And B, these hormones that are derived from tyrosine end up being able to sometimes act like proteins and polypeptides and sometimes act like steroids, so they really get their own class. And an example of tyrosine derivatives in the body are those that come from the thyroid gland, like T3 and T4, or triiodothyronine and thyroxine, that stimulate metabolism. And these tyrosine derivatives act really similarly to steroids. And then another example of tyrosine derivatives are catecholamines. And catecholamines are those hormones that are produced in the adrenal medulla that are involved in our fight or flight responses, like epinephrine and norepinephrine. And these tyrosine derivatives act really similarly to peptides by binding on the outside of the cell and releasing those secondary messengers inside the cell. And so the thyroid hormones that are tyrosine derivatives act like steroids, and the catecholamine tyrosine derivatives act like proteins and polypeptides. But it's important to remember that they form their own unique class because they're all derived from the amino acid tyrosine. And because I did it for proteins and polypeptides and steroids, I went ahead and I drew in what tyrosine looks like. So that's tyrosine, and that's the amino acid that this class of hormones is derived from. And so I know it's hard to make learning these types of hormones fun, but maybe at least we can let our minds blow up a little bit over the fact that the structure of these hormones dictates almost everything we think or do, from fear to hunger to urinating and pushing babies out. All of our responses to the world around us are signaled by hormones.
What are neurotransmitters? Well, neurotransmitters are chemical messengers that transmit signals from a nerve cell. These signals can be passed from one nerve cell to another, from a nerve cell to a muscle cell, or to a gland cell. Neurotransmitters are used by the brain to help regulate breathing, digestion, and even heartbeat. They can also affect other things such as concentration, sleep, and mood. So how do neurotransmitters work? When a nerve cell fires a nerve impulse, neurotransmitters are packaged inside of synaptic vesicles. These synaptic vesicles fuse with the cell membrane and release the neurotransmitters, which cross a fluid-filled gap called the synaptic cleft. These neurotransmitters land on receptor sites of another nerve cell and pass on the nerve impulse. This happens very quickly. More than 100 neurotransmitters have been identified, and some important neurotransmitters include acetylcholine, which is key in activating muscles. Norepinephrine increases heart rate and blood pressure. Dopamine deals with pleasure and rewards. GABA suppresses some types of anxiety, and serotonin, which promotes the sense of well-being and happiness.
I want to talk about the different types of neurotransmitters. Neurotransmitters are molecules that communicate information between neurons and their target cells at chemical synapses. There may be hundreds of different types of neurotransmitters, and they can be categorized in a number of different ways. But probably the most common is to divide them up by their molecular structure into amino acids, peptides, monoamines, and others. I'm going to mention a bunch of chemistry terms next. Don't worry about them if you don't know them, but if you are interested, there are many great videos on these topics on the Khan Academy. The first category of neurotransmitters I'm going to represent with these three neurotransmitters right here, and this category is the amino acids. Amino acid neurotransmitters. Amino acids, and that's these three right here. Amino acids have an amino group, this guy right here, and they have a carboxylic acid group, this part right here. And there are lots of different types of amino acids, but just a few of them function as neurotransmitters in the nervous system. The next category of neurotransmitters I'm going to represent with this one right here, and these are the peptides. Peptide neurotransmitters. And I'll just have this one representative here. Peptides are actually polymers or chains of amino acids. So a bunch of these amino acids get strung together in these chains, these polymers, and we call them peptides. Peptides are much larger molecules than all the other types of neurotransmitters. So sometimes people divide up neurotransmitters just into peptides, and they lump together all the other neurotransmitters and call them small molecule neurotransmitters. The neurotransmitters in this row will represent our next big category, which are the monoamines. Monoamine neurotransmitters, monoamines. That's this whole row. I've picked out 5 representative neurotransmitters for the monoamines. And these are also sometimes called biogenic amines. So either monoamines or biogenic amines. And the monoamines are organic molecules with an amino group here and here and here, here, and here, connected to an aromatic group here, 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 and here. And the amino group and the aromatic group are connected by a 2-carbon chain. This part here, and here, and here, here, and here. Some of the monoamines, these three, let me draw little stars next to these three, are also called by a different name. And that name, let me draw a little star, that name is the catecholamines. Catecholamines. And so catecholamines are a subgroup of the monoamines, and the catecholamines have a catechol group, which is this part right here, which has a benzene, this ring, and 2 hydroxyl groups. Here's one hydroxyl group, and here's another hydroxyl group. And so this catechol group, all the catecholamines have this group, these 3 right here. And then there are many other types of neurotransmitters that are not amino acids or monoamines or peptides. And this neurotransmitter right here is going to be the representative for that. And so I'll just call this category other. These are the other molecular types of neurotransmitters. So now I'm going to introduce some important neurotransmitters in these different groups, and I'm going to mention some of their functions. But don't worry too much about their functions right now, because they do so many different things in different parts of the nervous system that we'll come back to all of that in other videos. But I just want to briefly introduce the different important neurotransmitters in each of these classes. Starting with the amino acids, important amino acid neurotransmitters are this one, which is called glutamate. This one, which is called gamma aminobutyric acid, which pretty much everybody just shortens to GABA, G-A-B-A, for gamma aminobutyric acid. And then this one, which is glycine. Now, glutamate is the most common excitatory neurotransmitter of the nervous system. So let me just draw a big plus sign above glutamate here, because most of the time in the nervous system, when a neuron is releasing a neurotransmitter that is exciting its target cell, most of the time that neurotransmitter is glutamate, because it usually causes depolarization of target cells so that it excites them. GABA and glycine are the most common inhibitory neurotransmitters of the nervous system. So let me just write some big minus signs above GABA and glycine, because they usually cause hyperpolarization of target cells and inhibit those target cells. GABA is the most common inhibitory neurotransmitter in the brain, while glycine is the most common inhibitory neurotransmitter in the spinal cord. So that the amino acid neurotransmitters are really involved in most functions of the nervous system. Pretty much if you think of anything the nervous system is doing, at some point in the chains and networks of neurons, glutamate, GABA, and or glycine are probably involved in moving information through those networks. There are many important monoamine neurotransmitters, but I'm just going to mention these 5 that are arguably the most important. The first one here is serotonin. The next one here is histamine. The next one is called dopamine. Then this one is epinephrine. And right next to epinephrine is its close cousin, norepinephrine. So that all 5 of these are monoamine neurotransmitters, but these 3, dopamine, epinephrine, and norepinephrine, are also called catecholamines. The monoamines play a lot of different functions in the nervous system, and in particular a lot of functions of the brain, including big things like consciousness and attention and cognition or thinking and emotion or us having feelings. Norepinephrine is also released by some autonomic neurons in the peripheral nervous system. Many disorders of the nervous system involve abnormalities of these monoamine neurotransmitter systems, and many drugs that people commonly take affect the monoamine neurotransmitters. There are many important peptide neurotransmitters, including a group of peptide neurotransmitters called the opioids. And the opioids are a group within the bigger group of the peptide neurotransmitters. And this one is one example of an opioid. This is endorphin. Endorphin. And the peptide neurotransmitters play a role in many functions of the nervous system, but the opioids in particular play a big role in our perception of pain. And a number of pain medications affect the opioid neurotransmitters. And last, but definitely not least, are the other neurotransmitters. Now, usually when there's an other category of anything, that means it's not very important. But in the case of neurotransmitters, there are some really important neurotransmitters that are not amino acids, monoamines, or peptides. For example, this neurotransmitter right here is called acetylcholine. Acetylcholine. And acetylcholine is definitely one of our most important neurotransmitters. It does a number of functions in the central nervous system. And then in the peripheral nervous system, it's released by most neurons in the autonomic nervous system. Let me just write ANS for autonomic nervous system. And it's released by the neurons called motor neurons that synapse on skeletal muscle and tell our skeletal muscle to contract to make us move. So again, don't worry too much about these functions, because in other videos we'll go more into the structure and the function of the nervous system and talk about specific neurotransmitter pathways. But I just wanted to introduce the different types of neurotransmitters here and start to give you a feel for the huge variety of functions all these different neurotransmitters have.
The amygdala is a collection of nuclei found in the temporal lobe. There are two amygdalae, one in each cerebral hemisphere. The term amygdala means almond, referring to one of the most prominent nuclei of the amygdala that has an almond-like shape. The major nuclei of the amygdala include the lateral nucleus, basal nucleus, accessory basal nucleus, central nucleus, medial nucleus, and cortical nucleus. Each of these nuclei can also be partitioned into subnuclei. One common scheme for anatomically organizing the amygdala is to divide it into a basolateral region made up of the lateral, basal, and accessory basal nuclei, and a corticomedial region made up of the cortical, medial, and central nuclei. There are, however, other common ways of anatomically dividing the amygdala as well. The amygdala has traditionally been considered part of the limbic system, a group of structures linked to the processing of emotions. The amygdala has historically best been known for its role in processing fearful emotions. When a threatening stimulus is present in the environment, it is thought that the amygdala is also involved in identifying it as a threat and initiating a fight or flight response to it. More recent evidence, however, indicates that the amygdala is active during the processing of positive stimuli as well. Thus, it is now thought the amygdala's role is more complex than that of a threat detector. It may be involved with assigning positive or negative value to stimuli, and with the consolidation of memories that have a strong positive or negative emotional component. It is also still being explored in a variety of other behaviors, ranging from addiction to social interaction. Thus, its functions are diverse and still not fully understood.
GABA is an inhibitory neurotransmitter in the central nervous system. So here is the amygdala here, and this is the fear centers. This is the fear center of the brain. So when you have anxiety, the amygdala is hyperactive and the fear circuits that it is connected to. So when you have anxiety, you have an overactive amygdala and overactive fear circuits, which the amygdala is connected to. So what happens is that we have GABA, these GABA neurons, which actually connect to the amygdala. So here's a GABA neuron here, and they connect to the amygdala via these connections, which are called the synapse. So the synapse between neurons is how neurons connect to one another, and they connect to one another via these neurotransmitters. So these are molecules which travel from one neuron to another neuron, and they basically cross this empty space between them to communicate with each other. So we do know that GABA is inhibitory. So when GABA So these GABA molecules here, when they're released into the synapse and they bind to the postsynaptic receptors here, so these receptors, these GABA receptors here on the amygdala, then what happens is when GABA binds to these receptors, it actually inhibits the amygdala and it slows down the hyperactivity of the amygdala, and therefore it reduces anxiety. So in the GABA neuron, there are GABA neurotransmitters in these vesicles. So these vesicles then release their contents into the synapse. So GABA is released from the vesicles into the synapse. The GABA then travels across the synapse, binds to the receptors, the GABA receptors here, and this in turn, what it does, when GABA binds to these GABA receptors, it actually opens up these, there's an ion channel that these receptors are part of. So when GABA binds to these GABA receptors, this ion channel opens up and it lets chloride in. So when chloride is let in, it actually inhibits the transmission of the neurotransmission postsynaptically. So in essence, when GABA binds and the chloride ion channel is open, then it basically inhibits the neurotransmission, and therefore it reduces the hyperactivity of the amygdala. GABA then is also reabsorbed. It's recycled by being reabsorbed by what's called a GABA reuptake pump, which is similar to other neurotransmitters that we have studied, such as the serotonin reuptake pump. So GABA also has a reuptake pump to recycle GABA that's in the synapse, and the reuptake pump here then pumps GABA back into the presynaptic neuron here, which is the GABA neuron. So we do know that there are some drugs and supplements, oral supplements, that actually, when you take it, they actually block the reuptake of GABA and thereby effectively increases the GABA concentration in the synapse. And what that does is, when you increase GABA concentration in the synapse by blocking the reuptake pump here, is that there is more GABA in the synapse, and therefore there's more binding of GABA to these postsynaptic receptors. And what happens is you have more opening of ion channels, and this therefore increases the inhibition of the amygdala and therefore decreases anxiety even more, because the hyperactivity is reduced from the increase in GABA from the drug or the supplement that you take. So
Dr. Streeter, can you talk a bit about your recent research on yoga and how it affects the brain?
Sure. The observation is that yoga had been reported to improve symptoms in depression, anxiety, and epilepsy. And all three of those disorders are treated with medications that increase the activity of gamma-aminobutyric acid, which we call GABA. And it's the primary inhibitory neurotransmitter in the brain, and things like alcohol and Valium work on the GABA receptor. Prozac will increase the activity of the GABA system. So I thought that, well, since yoga helps with all these three disorders, and all three disorders are treated with medications that increase GABA, that maybe yoga works in part by increasing GABA. So the study took people who didn't do yoga at all, and we scanned them using an MRI scan, and we did what was called magnetic resonance spectroscopy, which allows us to measure metabolites in the brain, and we measured their GABA levels. And then they were randomized to 12 weeks of either a yoga intervention, which was mostly postures, or a walking intervention. And then at the end of the 12 weeks, we scanned them again. They got out of the scanner. We did yoga or walking for an hour, and they got back in the scanner. People's mood, positive mood was correlated with GABA levels, and decreased anxiety was correlated with GABA levels at the beginning of the study, which shows that this is a generally true observation. The yoga group reported much greater improvement in their mood and less anxiety over the 12-week study. Their GABA levels were highly correlated with their mood and anxiety, and immediately after they had done an hour of yoga, the yoga group, you could see that their GABA levels had gone up, where the walking group's GABA levels had not gone up. And as the GABA levels went up, the change in GABA levels were highly correlated with the change in mood. So you could show that they were mood was going up as the GABA levels were going up. So this is an exciting study because it's the first study that shows a metabolite in the brain is associated with a behavioral intervention like yoga. And the pattern of the GABA levels going up with the yoga intervention and having improved mood is similar to the pattern seen when depressed people are treated with Prozac and have improved mood and improved GABA levels. So it's an exciting concept to have yoga as an adjunctive treatment, not as a substitute necessarily for medications, but as an add-on. And it can be considered for a lot of disorders.
And do you think this type of study will trigger doctors, psychologists, psychiatrists to start actually prescribing yoga as an adjunct, or do you think people are still nervous about it?
Well, I think that they don't know about it. I think that's one of the issues. I think if you're familiar with yoga, it's not hard to recommend it. If you're not familiar with it, then it's not as easy to recommend. And so, but I think that, you know, there are lots of yoga studios around because lots of people are doing it. And I think it's something to be considered as part of an overall treatment plan.
And you did this research collaboratively?
I did this research, thank you very much. We did this collaboratively with people at McLean Hospital. Dr. Jensen is the one who got the GABA levels, and it is very tricky to get GABA levels. So he was an essential part of the study.
Thank you.
The point of this slide is that the yoga group consistently reported over the course of the study that they were feeling better on these various markers of mood and anxiety than the walking group. So I would argue that it's more than just exercise because the exercise was controlled for.
The ancient practice of yoga has been proven effective for reducing symptoms in a variety of disorders, including anxiety, depression, and epilepsy. These disorders are all associated with low levels of GABA, and the symptoms can be reduced by substances known to increase GABA system activity. A 2007 pilot study showed that brain levels of GABA was increased by 27% after a 60-minute session of yoga. This study was done on experienced yoga practitioners. The researchers wanted to find out if the changes in GABA levels were specific to yoga or whether they could arise from a walking session with similar intensity. In 2010, they published the study Effects of Yoga versus Walking on Mood, Anxiety, and Brain GABA Levels, a randomized controlled MRS study. They showed that Iyengar yoga, this time practiced by beginners, increased brain GABA levels, whereas walking did not. The yoga group also reported greater improvement in mood and greater decrease in anxiety than the walking group. This indicates that higher brain GABA levels improves mood and decreases anxiety. The yoga group had only been doing yoga for 12 weeks and saw an increase in brain GABA levels by 13%. The experienced yoga practitioners in the first study saw a 27% increase, around twice as much as the beginners. Thus, the effects seemed to increase with experience. For those of you who want to go deeper, here are some more studies and a look at some of the mechanisms that might be responsible for yoga's effect on GABA levels. The parasympathetic nervous system is, said simply, a part of your nervous system that calms and relaxes you. Yoga's effect on GABA levels may be connected with yoga's ability to increase activity in the parasympathetic nervous system. The way yoga does this seems to be in part through stimulating a nerve called the vagus nerve. And it is suggested that vagus nerve stimulation stimulates release of GABA.
Yoga might be one of the most powerful tools in your brain health arsenal. So for one, doing yoga has been shown to boost levels of BDNF in the brain. Now, I talk about BDNF all the time because I think it's really important to know about it.
Meditation and yoga increase BDNF.
So BDNF is this neurotrophic growth factor in the brain that protects your neurons. And you can actually boost this by doing yoga. Higher levels of BDNF have been associated with a lower risk of dementia and even depression. So I think this is a really good thing. Now, serotonin is a neurotransmitter very much involved in your mood, the way you think about the world and even yourself. And this is something that you can easily boost by doing yoga. You might already be familiar with serotonin because there are a plethora of antidepressant drugs on the market, and essentially what these drugs do is boost levels of serotonin in the brain. But you can actually do this without taking drugs by doing a downward dog. How crazy is that? Now, the third way that yoga enhances your brain health is that it protects your gray matter. Now, this is true. Everybody loses a little bit of gray matter volume as they get older. This is an unfortunate truth, but it's not inevitable, and you can actually protect your gray matter volume by doing exercise. But recently, a study looked specifically at yoga and found that controls in the study displayed the well-documented age-related global brain gray matter decline, while yogis did not, suggesting, their words, that yoga contributes to protect the brain against age-related decline. How amazing is that? Now, I admit these might be abstract concepts. You can't exactly open up your skull and look at your brain to check out how your gray matter is doing, but the fourth way that yoga benefits your brain is by enhancing its function. A study recently showed that just by doing one single 20-minute yoga session, you can actually improve the function of your brain. Researchers reported that a single 20-minute session of Hatha Yoga significantly improved the ability to maintain focus and take in, retain, and use new information. So this is really cool. Do yoga before a test. Do yoga before a job interview. I see nothing but benefits to doing yoga, and it's great to know that it actually benefits your brain and your brain function in real time.
Do you think there's anything particularly unique about yoga, or is it this effect if you do some physical activity that you like and make it a habit?
Okay, so I know several people who both meditate and run, and they tell me that, and I know from my own experience, because I told you I was a runner for many years, that qualitatively there's something very different between running and meditating, or running and doing yoga. Like there's a different level. Like when I've done running or exercising, I'm worn out. After I do yoga, I'm not worn out. I'm refreshed. So for me, there's a really big difference. And I think there's also studies showing that like it doesn't cause inflammation. Like exercise causes inflammation, whereas yoga does not. So there are qualitative differences between it. So it may just be the exercise component of yoga, but they are qualitatively different. Okay. And I can tell you, because again, I exercised for years, and then I started doing yoga, and within 3 weeks, it's just like, wow, there's something here that's not just exercise for me. And I know, again, same with meditation for a lot of people. It's like, there's something very different in those states.